Welcome to our last lecture for the semester. Today we'll be continuing with the topic we started last time, which is applied anthropology. What do anthropologists know and how can they help solve some of the world's contemporary problems, both social and environmental? And so today we'll be continuing with that, but specifically focusing on environmental anthropology. What is it? And how can anthropologists help solve environmental problems? Before getting into that, one quick announcement. We do have our third and final exam coming up soon. The date for the exam is listed on the syllabus. I'll also be sending announcements out about that. But note that we do need to take the exam on the day originally scheduled by the college, by the university. And so the exam format is almost identical to exams 1 and 2. There'll be 35 to 40 multiple choice questions worth 70% of the exam score, and then one essay question worth 30% of the score. And so as with exam 2, I have for exam 3 posted your essay question study guide, and I have told you explicitly ahead of time which essay question is going to be on the exam. So you should study and prepare for the test in advance, as if you were going to be taking it in class. Note, it's by definition open book, but it's timed, and so you won't have time to search for each answer to the questions while you're actually taking the test. Make sure you read the study guide in full. It tells you exactly what you're responsible for, as well as which essay question you should prepare for. And you may and you should use your prepared response to the essay question during the exam. I really urge you to prepare that in advance, write it out, have it ready to go, and use it during the exam. With that, be sure to use your own words because we're not writing it in class, we're writing it from home. Make sure you put it in your own words. Otherwise, it'll be considered plagiarism. So just make sure, again, that you're putting the information into your own words and prepare that essay ahead of time. Even though only one question will be on the exam, preparing for the rest of the essay questions will help you with the multiple choice section. One last note, one slight difference with exam 3 from prior exams. Well, two differences. One, again, we have to take it on a specific day at a specific time. Unlike with past exams and quizzes, you've had a several day window to take them. And the second major difference is there's a very slight cumulative aspect on exam 3 for the essay portion only. This is explained again in the study guide, so read it. It's nothing to stress about. You don't need to go back and relearn everything we've covered this semester. You have the questions in advance for the essay portion. So if there's something the question is asking you about that we've covered prior to this last third of the semester, like the material approach or interpretive approach, go back and see what that was all about and then incorporate it into your answer. And that's the extent of the cumulative aspect. There is a slight aspect to that for the essays, but you have the questions ahead of time. So if you do need to go check on anything from the past, you can easily do that. And then the multiple choice section is strictly on this past third of the course. So everything that we've covered since the second exam up until before we take the third exam. A couple of tips. Again, you should prepare your answer in advance to the essay question. And don't simply string together a list of loosely related observations and facts. I want a clear, concise, appropriate argument. Illustrate and explain the concepts and examples that you draw upon to support your points. And make sure you connect them back to the argument you're making. And then, of course, review the material as many times as necessary until it starts to stick. Lectures, readings, and films are all fair game. Pay particular attention to material that keeps coming up again and again in lectures and the readings. If you have any questions about the exam, either content or structure, please reach out, contact me. I am here to help. Okay. And so today, environmental anthropology. What is it and how can anthropologists help address the environmental issues we face? And so environmental anthropology is a sub-discipline of cultural anthropology. And it's a type Well, let me back up. So it's a subdiscipline of cultural anthropology, and it blends the natural sciences with the social sciences. So it links cultural anthropology with ecology. Humans are part of the total ecological system. It is a total socio-ecological system, and it should be studied that way. You can't study ecology without including humans as a component of it. Especially today, we're having a massive impact on the environments around us. And so it looks at both the environment and humans and the mutual interaction between the two. And it doesn't focus just on contemporary interaction, but addresses both past and present human environment interactions throughout space and time. So how have humans adapted to their environments throughout space and time? Sort of the materialist approach, right? How did the Kung adapt via hunting and gathering to the Kalahari environment? But also, not only how do humans adapt to their environment, how do they simultaneously mutually influence and shape their environments? Um, right? It's cyclical and ongoing. And there's various approaches in environmental anthropology, and I'll touch on a few just to give you a flavor of what this field is all about. And so these include political ecology, historical ecology, and also human ecology. And so I'll start from the bottom up. Historical ecology, or excuse me, human ecology emerges sort of in the 70s, early 70s, in reaction to the way ecology was being done at the time. Environmentalists, ecologists, biologists were studying the environment without attention to the social systems that inhabit those environments. That's a key component influencing the environment. And so you're not really studying the ecology if you're not studying all components, including the human component. Human ecology then emerges to correct for this and says you have to also include humans as a component of the total ecological system if you want to understand what's going on in the environment and how humans are influencing it. Historical ecology looks at sort of the long-term human-environment interaction in different societies throughout space and time. And so the goal is to try to gain an understanding of the cumulative effects of human environment interaction over time. Like, for example, up to 20% of the Amazon rainforest is now considered anthropogenic, meaning human created. Just briefly, small-scale societies that lived in Amazonia in the past, pre-Columbian, pre-colonial times, they modified the Amazon on a large scale through planting specific species that were useful to them for food. They also altered the soil to make it more fertile for growing food. But it doesn't look like what we typically think of in the Western world as human modified. It's the Amazon rainforest. It doesn't get more pristine and natural than that. However, historical ecology shows us that these natural environments are indeed partially also anthropogenic. There's a long history of humans interacting in their environments, right? In Africa, in South America, in all these various places. Humans have been part of their environments for over 2 million years, really. Anatomically modern Homo sapiens evolving roughly 100,000 years ago, but really not that much different than their ancestors 2 million years before that. And so historical ecology seeks to understand this interaction over time. And then there's political ecology. And so this adds yet a further component to studying socio-ecological systems. It still looks at how humans interact with their environment and are influenced by them, but it adds a political component and says, how is this human environment interaction often influenced in an unequal way? By power dynamics, by the structure of the system. And so the case study we just read from Hartman and Boyce, that's sort of a political ecology approach. Hartman and Boyce are looking at this village Katni in Bangladesh where there's hunger, famine, poverty, and yet there's food surpluses in the country. And so you can explain this via political ecology. Humans are interacting with their environment unequally because of differential power. Some have land and others don't, which means some are able to grow food, some have economic security, and others don't. So how do politics, power differences between individuals and groups that create differential access to resources, how does this add a further component to how humans interact with their various environments? So that's a little bit about environmental anthropology. who cares? How can environmental anthropology have applications for helping to address and solve contemporary human environmental problems? And make our beliefs and practices more sustainable so that the very life support system that supports us, the earth, the planet, doesn't become so degraded that it can no longer provide for us. And so there's sort of three main veins I want to highlight for you in terms of the applications environmental ANT has for addressing our environmental problems. The first is the role that ideology, worldview, how people understand the world, their belief system. How does ideology shape human environment interaction? How does it drive behavior, which in turn has implications for how sustainable that interaction is? The second vein that we'll explore is related to this notion of ideology, understanding how we understand problems or concepts. And so the second thing we'll talk about is called the individualization of responsibility. It's this default frame, the go-to explanation for how to solve our environmental problems, which always focuses on the individual, which I would also add is not the majority of the problem. We'll get to this when we get to this, but how does the framing of the problem shape the solutions we come up with? And if we're not understanding the problem correctly, then what good are the solutions anyways? And then the sort of third thing I want to highlight for you towards the end of the lecture is how we can look at other types of societies, small and large scale, but mostly small scale and indigenous societies, as examples. How have other societies interacted with their environment, managed their resources? How sustainable have they been or not from different places and time periods? And what can we learn from these societies to inform our own future directions for sustainability? Okay, so with these three things in mind, we'll start first with the role of ideology in shaping environmental outcomes. So how does culture, and especially ideology, worldview, belief systems, how people understand the world around them, their place in it, how things work, how does ideology influence patterns of behavior and thus interaction with the environment? This has implications for how sustainable resource and environmental interaction is. Sort of this idea, for example, of is nature something to conquer, to extract from, it belongs to us, or is it something to conserve, to tread lightly on? We're all part of it. These are two sort of different examples of ideology, how people view nature and the environment. The conquered sort of nature is something to conquer, it belongs to us. This has roots in Christianity. Not all Christian sects. The exact opposite belief also exists in Christianity. But sort of that God gave man dominion over the earth, right? It belongs to us. It's here for us. People truly have this ideology, this belief, and that translates into how they're going to treat things, how they're going to treat resources in the environment. If it's here for us, why not just exploit the shit out of it, right? Also in Christianity, we're not going to be here that long anyways, right? This life is fleeting. It's the afterlife that's long lasting. The opposite side of the spectrum, nature or the environment is something to conserve. This is in line sort of with environmental movements, Earth Day, also kind of falls in line with the way small scale indigenous societies tend to sort of treat their environments. Although not necessarily intentional conservationists, small-scale societies tend to be overall more sustainable in how they treat their environment. For example, this sort of God gave us the earth, it's ours to conquer. This is Ann Coulter, a very, very prominent opinion host. She has a Fox Entertainment Network show. And Ann Coulter, this is one of the more gentle quotes out of her mouth. God gave us the earth. We have dominion over the plants, the animals, the trees. God said, earth is yours. Take it, rape it, it's yours. Ann Coulter. So that's one example of how ideology can drive behavior and in turn drive how sustainable or not we are. This idea of looking at how worldview, culture, ideology drives behavior, how what we think drives how we act, this falls under the interpretive approach that we spoke about way back in the beginning of the semester. these two main approaches for understanding what leads cultures to be similar and or different. The materialist approach, which sort of holds that the main, most important driving force in shaping cultures is how humans meet their basic needs in their environment. And therefore, the culture, the society will be shaped through adaptation to the environment. Materialist approach. The interpretive approach is sort of the opposite, and they're not mutually exclusive, meaning just because one sort of works doesn't mean the other one is false. It depends on what we're looking at. And so in the interpretive approach, this says it's not environment that's key. It's not the material forces. The most important thing is how people think, what's in their heads, what's their ideology, their values, their belief system. This in turn will drive behavior and how people organize around the environment, and in turn, whether or not that's sustainable. And so the key point is that from the interpretive approach, again, which holds that ideology, what we think, will drive how we behave, it is these distinct worldviews about nature to conquer or to conserve. These distinct worldviews that generate different rationalities to what our environmental problems and solutions should be, and hence they come up with different solutions to our environmental problems. Remember in the beginning of class, we talked about the movie The Matrix. Keanu Reeves plays the main character, Neo, and he's walking around what he thinks is New York. He goes to work, goes to the store, blah, blah. But all of that's actually not real. His reality is being shaped by the Matrix, this simulated reality where he thinks he's walking around living his life. He's actually lying motionless in this pod, having his body energy and heat harvested as an energy source by these machines. And they created the Matrix, this simulation, to keep the human captives lying in these pods docile, to keep them subjugated, calm. And so in the movie, Neo gets rescued. He realizes reality is not real. It's actually being shaped by the Matrix, and blah, blah, blah. See the movie if you want. But the Matrix, remember, it's a metaphor for culture in the same way that Neo's reality, what he thought was real, what he perceived around him, wasn't in fact objective reality, but rather it was shaped by the Matrix, the simulation. And in the same way, Matrix as a metaphor for culture, the way you perceive the world around you, the way you understand things, your ideology, your worldview, your perception of the world is also shaped. Not by the Matrix, but by our culture, by the culture in which we are brought up in, right? The pill you take, the culture you swallow is going to influence how you see the world. So from the interpretivist point of view, these differing ideas about nature to conquer or to conserve are what makes sustainability so problematic. People don't agree. Thoughtful people have different and mutually irreconcilable ideas of just what is sustainable and what is not. And therefore, they come up with different solutions or non-solutions to our problems because they have different understandings of what faces us. Let's look at a couple of different examples of very different worldviews about nature. And again, worldview is influenced by culture in addition to upbringing, family, values, and other things. And so examples, the voluntary human extinction movement, the acronym pronounced vehement. And we'll also look at an example from Rush Limbaugh. So first, the voluntary human extinction movement. And I'm just going to read from what their website says. Vehement, pronounced vehement, is a movement, not an organization. It's a movement advanced by people who care about life on planet Earth. We're not just a bunch of misanthropes and antisocial Malthusian misfits taking morbid delight whenever disaster strikes humans. Nothing could be farther from the truth. Voluntary human extinction is the humanitarian alternative to human disasters. We don't carry on about how the human race has shown itself to be a greedy, amoral parasite on the once healthy face of this planet. That type of negativity offers no solution to the inexorable horrors which human activity is causing. Rather, the movement presents an encouraging alternative to the callous exploitation and wholesale destruction of Earth's ecology. As vehement volunteers know, the hopeful alternative to the extinction of millions of species of plants and animals is the voluntary extinction of one species, Homo sapiens, us. Each time another one of us decides to not add another one of us to the burgeoning billions already squatting on this ravaged planet, another ray of hope shines through the gloom. When every human chooses to stop breeding, Earth's biosphere will be allowed to return to its former glory. All remaining creatures will be free to live, die, evolve if they believe in evolution, and will perhaps pass away as so many of nature's experiments have done throughout the eons. It's going to take all of us going. Okay, so on the one hand, Behemoth sees the problems to our environment caused by human activity as so detrimental that the only solution is for us to voluntarily stop reproducing and go extinct so that we no longer have an impact and stop destroying the planet. That's one view on one side of the spectrum. Sort of another example from the other side of the spectrum, and this comes from Rush Limbaugh. It says Professor Limbaugh, but he doesn't have a degree or any credentials. He's a talk show host. And so what I want you to do is go ahead and pause the lecture and watch this clip. It's only a minute. It's audio only. You can either type the link in from this slide, or I've also put the link in the description box to this YouTube video. So you can copy and paste it from there, pop it into your browser, and watch it. It's about a minute, audio only. Go ahead, watch it, and then come back to lecture. Okay, so hopefully you watched the clip. And so Rush Limbaugh, who, by the way, he is a conservative talk show radio host, conservative Republican. He actually recently was just awarded like the Medal of Freedom at the United States, the State of the Union address that the president recently gave. For reasons kind of unknown, he's actually been known to spread a lot of misinformation and really extremely racist, disgusting rhetoric. So, anyways, that's kind of who Rush Limbaugh is, and it's important. I'm not pointing it out to villainize him, but it's important to know where these people come from, because ideas don't exist in a vacuum, right? They come from people, and people may or may not be informed of what they're talking about. They may have alternative objectives. It may not actually be about health or what's best for people. It might be about someone's agenda or own values, which may be based on misinformation. And so anyways, Rush Limbaugh says that, oh my God, to even think about the fact global warming is a fucking hoax. And this is what he says, not me. It's not a hoax, it's happening. And to even think about that there's an environmental problem is absolutely stupid. And because there's no problem, we do not need to take any actions towards the environment or solving environmental problems or becoming more sustainable. It's stupid because we don't actually have a problem. CO2 can't be bad for the environment. It's part of how we breathe. We exhale it. Rush Limbaugh. And just to be clear, scientists are not interested in the role of CO2 directly on human health, right? Because, yeah, we do exhale it. They are interested in the role CO2 plays in warming up the global atmosphere, which is in turn causing rapid climate change. CO2 is a greenhouse gas, meaning relative to other molecules in the atmosphere, it absorbs and re-radiates more solar radiation than other molecules. And so essentially greenhouse gases like CO2 or methane, they trap more heat in the atmosphere relative to other atmospheric molecules. The more greenhouse gases we pump into the atmosphere, the more heat we trap, which in turn is driving climate change. Much of climate change centers around temperature gradients. That's what weather really is. And so if you change the temperature gradient just a little bit via global warming, this will cause climate change manifest in more extreme weather, which is exactly what we're seeing. So just to clarify that. And so on the one hand, you have the voluntary human extinction movement. It sees human activity as so detrimental to our resource base that we literally need to go extinct. On the other hand, you have Rush Limbaugh. And we don't have environmental problems. We exhale CO2. And so anyone that thinks that we have an issue, you're stupid. The point, again, is not to villainize either side, which it can be hard not to, right? But sustainability is problematic, not because there are all sorts of villains and ignoramuses out there. There are some, But it's not because there's just a bunch of villains hell-bent on unsustainability. It is because people, virtuous and thoughtful people, educated or not, have different and mutually irreconcilable ideas of just what is sustainable and what is not. It is these contradictory worldviews on climate change and sustainability that underlie the different positions, right? Why people don't agree and why it's difficult to move forward. The way we frame the problem is going to influence how we propose to solve it, right? As you see with Vehement and Rush Limbaugh. Okay, so on a related note, the second thing I want to highlight for you um, is this notion of how we talk about and frame a problem or an issue is going to shape how we understand it and in turn shape the solutions that we come up with. If you're not understanding the problem correctly and you're not asking the right questions, then the solutions you come up with are going to be flawed. They're not going to be solutions. And so this these clips come from a San Francisco newspaper from 2014. Governor Brown called on individuals at this time to reduce their water usage by 20%, excuse the typo, because we are in an extreme drought at the time, the most extreme ever recorded. And I'm telling you right now that it will not be the last. We will be right back where we are because we don't really have much water in California. Most of it comes from the Colorado River, 50% to be exact. And so from the article, Brown committed to using his executive powers to steer water where it's most needed. He directed state agencies to immediately scale back water consumption. Perhaps more importantly, the governor called on Californians to voluntarily reduce their water use by 20%. One of the most important things that you have to have happen is that people need to use less water. Okay, so notice that they briefly mention state agencies and larger organizations, but the main focus, where the most important impact is going to be, is individuals. One of the most important things you can have happen. Individual actions do matter. Turning off the tap, recycling, taking shorter showers, get rid of your lawn. It adds up. It does matter. Don't get me wrong. I'm not saying it doesn't matter. It does. But how much water do individuals actually use in the state of California? And think about it. All drought reduction, all conservation strategies are essentially focused on you, on individuals. You should use less, reuse, get rid of this, do that. You. How can you help? Individual actions matter, but who actually uses most of the water? Most of the water is not used by individuals or households. If you look at the figure, 80%, over 80% of the water in the entire state of California goes to agriculture, to farming. On top of that, farmers only pay about 17% of the cost of that water because it's heavily subsidized by the government, meaning we use tax dollars to pay for the water that the farmers use to make their costs of production cheaper. And it's not the small farmer benefiting, it's large scale farms and corporations that are getting the subsidies. Don't worry too much about that, but I just want to mention it because keep in mind 80% of the water is going to agriculture. It's subsidized, meaning the people using it aren't really paying for it. And if you're not really paying for it and you're getting money based off how much you use, which is how they identify need, there is no incentive to conserve it. And in fact, these large farms will lose the subsidy if they don't use all of the water because it's based off use, which is identifiable need. So even if they don't need all the water, the incentive is to still use it all so they get that subsidy next year, that tax money back. 80% of the water goes to agriculture. You can take all the fucking shorter showers you want. It will not solve the water crisis in California. 20%, that tiny red slice of the pie, that's household and individual use, and all other urban uses, including residential, commercial, institutional, and industrial using. That red slice of the pie is everything but agriculture. And so great, focus on individuals, take shorter showers. That's not the majority of the problem, and therefore that will not be the solution. These structural organizational factors are far more important in terms of sustainability. And by structural factors, I mean the way the economic and social system is set up, the policies surrounding water use and prices. These structural factors are so much more important in terms of environmental impact. And again, most of that water, 80%, most of it's subsidized. The farmers, these large farmers, aren't actually even paying for it. And so this consistent focus on the individual, you should use less, you should do this to solve our problems. This is called the default framing for sustainability. It's the individualization of responsibility for environmental problems. It's the default, it's the go-to. We automatically, without even thinking about it, oh, we're in a drought, what should we do? Use less, shorter showers, get rid of your lawn. Default, go-to. We don't even have to think about it. We know the solution. You need to use less. This is the default frame. And it's a major barrier to sustainability. It disproportionately emphasizes individuals, even though that's a small part of the problem of the impact. The focus on the individual makes it seem like the problem is ours and ours only to solve. And most importantly, by consistently focusing on individuals, it glosses over and ignores the larger issues and causes underlying problems in sustainability with water or whatever in California. Okay? Individual actions still matter, but they are a smaller part of the problem than you may have been led to believe. And the consistent focus on individuals ignores the larger organizational problems. The fact that 80% of the water goes to agriculture. Who do you think is going to waste more water? Individuals or organizations? And the picture on the left, that's irrigation in Central Valley, where most of the water subsidies that go to large farms go. Not a responsible use of water. Think about how much evaporation is allowed to occur. But again, there's no incentive to conserve it. The policies are backwards. The incentives are backwards. They're getting paid for wasting it, essentially. Okay, so individualization of responsibility, the default frame, this is a major barrier to sustainability. And it's not just water, it's all things environmental. We're always focusing on what individual consumers can do. They are a small proportion of the issue compared to corporations and these larger organizational and structural barriers. So we've been sort of discussing, I've been trying to make a case for how environmental anthropology can help us understand and therefore solve environmental problems. But I haven't really made a case yet that the environment needs saving, that we're facing problems. And so we will turn to that now. What is the current state of our life support system, the Earth, the planet, which we depend on for survival? And the relatively recent human environment interaction in the context of industrial and post-industrial society, our culture, has had major impacts on the environment. It's led to a lot of degradation, and overall, data would suggest it doesn't appear to be sustainable in the long run. There's a lot of evidence for this, and we'll look at a few strands of it to highlight what I mean. And keep in mind as we talk, why are humans destroying our life support system? Why? Humans have been around at least 100,000 years, anatomically, modernly speaking. And really, 2 million years. We weren't that much different from our ancestors 2 million years ago. And yet, this massive degradation of the environment has really only begun in the last 100 years, last couple hundred years since the Industrial Revolution, and especially just the last 50 years out of 2 million years of human existence. Why now? What's going on? And it's not human nature that causes environmental degradation. It's not an inevitable result of human societies. It is a result of the specific cultures and socio-cultural organizations that we have developed. Welcome to the Anthropocene. This is the cover of The Economist in 2011. And the Anthropocene, for those of you that haven't heard of it, is a term, a new term being used to describe what has been called a new geological epoch that we've entered. And the Anthropocene means the age of humans. And so the point of the Anthropocene is that humans are having such an impact on our environment, on the earth, that we've actually ushered in a new geological epoch, the Anthropocene, meaning the age of humans. And so it's this new term to describe the current epoch in which we're in. This is significant. Geological epochs are defined by observed changes in lithology, chemical composition, or some other event recognized worldwide in the Earth's strata and sediments, that archaeologists and geologists and other scientists can study these strata to study the Earth's history. So for example, on the slide, that shows in the stratigraphy the famous transition between the Cretaceous period and the Paleocene epoch. It's also called the CT boundary. This is the end of the dinosaurs. This is the end of the Cretaceous period 65 million years ago, when the dinosaurs went extinct. And it leaves a mark in the Earth's sediments that can be recognized, again, worldwide. And so this event was probably caused by the impact of a huge meteor, probably in the Gulf of Mexico. That in turn triggered global tsunamis, wildfires, and basically a start of a nuclear winter, where much of the sunlight was blotted out, and that in turn killed off the vegetation. The dying of the vegetation in turn killed off the herbivorous dinosaurs that fed off those plants, and in turn the carnivores that ate those herbivores also went extinct. And so this massive extinction is defined by the extinction of the dinosaurs and lots of other animals on the land and the sea. And so it's sort of disconcerting that stratigraphers have come to believe we are such an event, that humans have so altered the planet in just the past century or so, we've ushered in a new epoch, the Anthropocene. It's these major events like the extinction of the dinosaurs that breaks the planet's history into these comprehensible chapters. And again, it's kind of scary that humans and human activity may be such an event. We're currently in the most extreme extinction crisis since the dinosaur extinction. And it seems to is anthropogenic, meaning human caused. We'll get to that here shortly. And so humans plus our technology is becoming a geological force in its own right. Our mark is going to endure in the geological record long after our cities have crumbled and long after we're gone. We are modifying the Earth to such an extent that our impact is going to be visible in the geology of the planet far into the future. So evidence that these changes are indeed anthropogenic. People argue that there's always been natural fluctuations in environment and climate, and that's absolutely true, related to different glacial cycles, polar reversals, and other factors. However, the scale of these fluctuations has increased exponentially in a very short, rapid time period. And so what evidence is there that these massive changes occurring to the Earth are indeed a result of anthropogenic, meaning human activities? What types of planetary changes characterize the Anthropocene, the age of humans? And so in just the last really few hundred years, there's been many drastic changes, unprecedented really in our history. First, on the top, the graph shows massive increases in species extinction rates. Especially just in the last 100 to 50 years. The chart looks from 1750 to 2000, 1750 being the start of the Industrial Revolution, which has allowed for global market economies and globalization and global capitalism. And look at that exponential rate. And that's not extinctions in absolute numbers, that's in the thousands. So we're talking 50,000 species going extinct per year in recent decades. On the slide, that's a picture of the dodo, which is sort of an archetype of extinct animals because it's the first animal that went extinct. Its extinction occurred during recorded human history, and it was directly attributable to human activities. So the dodo was a flightless bird. Flightless birds don't do well when invasive species are typically introduced. Flightless bird in the Indian Ocean, islands in the Indian Ocean, related to pigeons and doves, about 3 feet tall, 44 pounds, ate fruit, and nested on the ground, again, flightless. And so the dodo's been extinct since the mid to late 17th century. Um, again, because of human activity. One of the main causes is we've been increasingly converting Earth's landscapes to human purposes, especially agricultural land. And the result is habitat loss for lots and lots of species. So that's one major cause behind species extinction rates, among numerous causes like pollution, increasing toxicity, acidification of our oceans, bleaching of our coral reefs. All these ecosystems, as we damage them, decrease habitats for species and biodiversity. So we're seeing exponential increases in extinction. The second middle graph, that shows northern hemisphere surface temperature anomalies. And so it's from 1000 to 2000. And what you're seeing is temperature anomalies, like it being colder than it's supposed to be at a given time or hotter than it's supposed to be at a given time. Temperature anomalies are increasing quite a bit. And so temperature gradients have been increasing. Surface temp has always fluctuated, but the anomalies have exponentially increased in just the last few hundred years, really the last 50 to 100. And this increase in surface temperature anomalies, it's related to the Industrial Revolution. Look at this time period, right? 1750, and that's right about when the anomalies start to go up, in 1750 down here. It's no mistake that as temperature anomalies go up, atmospheric CO2 concentration has also gone up. This is probably what's driving changes in temperature. As we release more CO2 into the atmosphere, the main cause being fossil fuel burning, the overall climate warms up a bit. It increases the temperature by a few degrees. The result of this is not an overall warmer climate. And this is why scientists have stopped calling it global warming. They call it climate change now, because climate change deniers, like President Trump, jump on global warming and say, but it's snowing, so global warming's false. That's not what global warming is. And that's why typically you hear people call it climate change now. So people can't use this red herring of, but it's snowing. That's stupid. What climate change actually is, what weather basically is different temperature gradients interacting. So if you have different temperatures in different air masses, those air masses also have different densities, right? And so as they move, you have dense air moves into less dense air. This creates weather. If you change the overall temperature of the climate by a couple of degrees, what you do is increase temperature gradients. And the result, therefore, of climate change is more temperature anomalies and more extreme weather, as these cold and hot air masses clash more violently because the temperature gradients have been increased. That's what climate change is all about. And we're already seeing it happening. And so it's not about it becoming summer everywhere. That's not what it's about. And if you hear people talking like that, they don't know what they're talking about. And so you see this massive increase in CO2 emissions also after the Industrial Revolution. CO2 is a greenhouse gas. It traps more heat relative to other atmospheric molecules. Again, meaning it traps more heat. It warms up, it increases those temperature gradients, causes increasing climate change. And even if we stopped emitting CO2 today, just stopped, the atmosphere would still continue to change in terms of temperature because of how much CO2 we've already emitted into the atmosphere. Another example of human activity causing changes, driving climate change and changes to our resource base. This is an example of decreasing species diversity and just dwindling species populations in general. McClanahan in 2009 published in Conservation Biology, very prestigious journal, documenting the loss of large trophy fish from the Florida Keys with historical photographs. And so it shows this concrete example of changes to our resource base. And what they did is they measured trends for several different groups of recreational caught fish. So in Key West, Florida, there's these 2 charter boats that have been operating since the 50s, and they're still operating today, basically in the same way. So people come, pay money, they go out on these boats, they go fishing, and that's what they do. And so this is 1957. This is landings from the two boats in 1957. Check out the size of the fish. Those are huge. They're as big as the people. And there's even some sharks there, sort of on the bottom. You can see down here. Look at that. Keep in mind the scale of the size of these fish compared to the people. And so McClinican looked at photos, historical photos from 1957, also historical photos from 1983. Again, the same 2 boats operating in the same place in Key West, landing fish on the same docks. 57 took pictures in 83, and then came in 2007 and took his own set of photographs of the fish landings in 2007. So good sized fish, large predatory species, a lot of reproductively mature adults being caught. This is a signal of a healthy fish population, a healthy ecosystem. Couple of things. Large predatory species, that's a good sign. It means you have enough other species in the ecosystem supporting those large apex predators. It means you have a healthy ecosystem. And another thing is, it also means you have reproductively mature adults in the population, which means the population can continue to breed and reproduce itself. If you start getting all small fish and not pulling adults out anymore, that's a problem. That means you might have already overfished that population to the point where it can't really successfully reproduce itself. You've pulled out all the reproducing adults. It's just young ones. They might make it, they might not. So 1957 looks good. This is 1983. Same 2 boats operating in the same way, landing in the same place. And these are the fish landings in 1983. Still not bad, still a pretty good sized fish. It's a little bit of shark right here, but not as big as the other ones. This is 1983. The first ones were 1957. And this is the photos he took in 2007. Same 2 boats operating in the same way, landing in the same place. Trophy fish. I mean, the mean average size declined from something like 20 kilograms to 2.3 kilograms. The point is our resource base, fish populations, other resources, they're dwindling. And fisheries specifically, so many have been caught, it's all just young ones. The population is crashing. And it's not just Key West. Fisheries experts estimate anywhere from 90 to 99% of our fish stocks around the world are already over or fully exploited, meaning they're probably not coming back. Other evidence that humans are driving environmental and climate changes. This shows atmospheric CO2 concentration back past the historical record, all the way back until 400,000 years before present. CO2 levels, as with other atmospheric gases, have always fluctuated up and down, but for the past 400,000 years, they've always remained below 300 parts per million. Parts per million is simply a measure of the volume, concentration of the gas in the atmosphere. Don't worry about it. Always below 300. From the Industrial Revolution into 1950, so in just 200 years, we, for the first time in 400,000 years, went above 300 parts per million. We were up to 310 by 1950. From 1950 to now, or 2000 roughly, we went from 310 to 380. Most of the increase in this has been just in the last 30 years. And just a few years ago, we, for the first time ever, passed the 400 parts per million mark. And we're probably never coming back down below that. As we continue to emit CO2, the atmosphere will continue to trap more heat. This will continue to change temperature gradients, driving climate change, extreme weather, rising sea levels, and all the other things we're starting to see. How do they measure this? How the hell do you know what atmospheric gas concentration was 400,000 years ago? They have some cool ways for doing this. One is ice cores. This data set comes from the Vostek site in Antarctica, and they take these long cylindrical hollow drills, drill them down into the ice and underlying bedrock, and pull out these ice cores. Trapped in the ice cores are gas bubbles. And you can then measure what types of molecules are trapped and use that as a proxy for atmospheric gas concentration during that time period. It's allowed us to extend our data record way back to about, again, 400,000 years before present. And there's several other lines of evidence to illustrate humans are indeed uh, changing, and many would argue degrading the earth, our life support system. And so because of this, people that do development work, remember we talked about development last time, trying to boost the economy or social well-being of other countries to improve livelihoods. And so economic growth and development is now needs to be done with a mind towards the environment and sustainability as well. So sustainable development is now defined as development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the needs of future generations to meet their own needs. So the idea being, you don't want to destroy the very resource base that the economy and that we depend on. Act sustainably so that the resources can continue to sustain us in the future, right? One thing to point out, does anyone notice something really vague or kind of ambiguous about this definition? What what I'm thinking of is, what are our needs? How is that defined? And are our needs always expanding? Do we need water? Yeah, food probably, sex. But what about an iPhone or a new shirt? Or right? In many cases, our needs go so far beyond human necessity. And so this is one really vague point in this definition. Is sustainability just about the earth? Earth for Earth's sake? Do we need to save the earth? Does the earth need us to save it? Who are we actually saving the earth for? Are environmental problems really about the environment? And so what we're going to do now is watch a brief clip by late comedian George Carlin. For those of you that don't know him, he's hilarious. And so we're going to watch this clip. The planet is fine. Go ahead and pause the lecture, type in the link, or also copy and paste the link from the description box in this YouTube video. Pop it in your browser and watch it. It's stand-up comedy. It's about 7 to 8 minutes, and it's funny, but there's a reason that we're watching it. So go ahead, pull up the link, pull up the video, watch it. It's about 7 minutes, almost 8 minutes, and then come back and join lecture. Okay, so hopefully you watched I know you just watched the George Carlin clip. Um, what is Earth Day? What are environmental movements really all about? Is it for the Earth? Yeah, maybe, but also it's for us. The Earth has a finite carrying capacity. It can only absorb so much CO2 and other toxins and pollutants before this starts to have consequences. And the environmental consequences of this are already apparent in the acidification of our oceans. As more and more CO2 enters the ocean because of the fossil fuels we're burning, it makes the water more acidic. This kills coral reef systems. It kills marine life. Shelled organisms aren't able to build their shells because calcium carbonate ions in the ocean have been dissolved by the acid, the CO2 that reacts with it. We see exponential extinction rates, global warming, climate change, increased natural disasters, rising sea levels, drought. Actually, a study at UNR a few years ago linked seismic activity, earthquakes in the Sierra Nevadas, to irrigation withdrawal in the Central Valley of California. And so much of these changes, they're not a result of natural fluctuations. They are a direct result of human activity and impact. But as George Carlin says, despite this, the planet is fine. The planet's doing fine. It's been through polar reversals and magnetic this and volcanoes and blah, blah. You want to know how the planet's doing? Ask those people in Pompeii that are frozen in volcanic ash if they feel like a threat to the planet today, right? The planet's going to be fine. It's always undergone massive exchange. It was here after the dinosaurs went extinct. Planet's going to be fine. It's the people that are fucked. We are destroying the earth, the resources, air, water that our very survival depends on. Planet's going to be here long into the future. The question is, will we? And we may not if we continue to degrade the very life support system on the planet that makes our life possible. And so, while the environmental movement and sustainability might be for Earth's sake, yeah, maybe Earth's sake because we like nature, we value the environment for its own sake, we respect it, we enjoy it, and I think a lot of that's true. But it's sustainability also for humans' sake, definitely, because many would argue we've approached some limits in terms of the environment. We're running up against environmental barriers in terms of the way we're doing things. Technology might be able to help mitigate this for a while, but not forever if we don't change the way we're doing things. And so becoming more sustainable isn't so much about the earth for earth's sake. You can feel that way, but really when you get down to it, it's also for humans, right? So that we can still be here. And so anthropologists have deemed many scientists have deemed we are in what has been termed a current environmental crisis, CEC for short. And there's two primary explanations anthropologists have given to explain the current environmental crisis we're in. Why are humans destroying the planet? The first explanation we've already touched on. Environmental degradation via humans is a consequence of certain cultural values, certain ideologies. For example, that God gave man dominion over nature, or that humans are somehow outside of nature. Right? Many Westerners tend to view the environment as separate from nature. And this the result of some of these views is we tend to exploit it, right, in ways that are not sustainable. And the second major explanation is that environmental destruction is a result of our current economic system, industrial capitalism, and global market economies, which generate a culture of consumption in order to continue accruing profits through marketing, through advertising, through spending billions on keeping us consuming to keep profits up. And we've already sort of talked about how in capitalism, it's dependent on continued consumption. This is what keeps the wheels turning. And so again, media advertising is all designed to keep us consuming. And if that's not enough, they have other strategies like built-in and planned obsolescence, and they make our shit break so we have to buy a new one. And they also do a good job of keeping us confused about what we need versus want, right? And so we always sort of have increasing desires. And industrial capitalism creates that because, again, it needs us to consume if it's to continue accruing profits. So if sustainable development is development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the needs of future generations to meet their own needs, um, so meaning being sustainable means not impacting the environment in so much so that future generations cannot use it. But how do we measure this? How do we even measure human impact on the environment? One way to conceptualize human impact on the environment is through this equation, this IPAT equation. And it's a conceptual equation, it's not quantifiable, so it's for conceptualization purposes. One way to think about human impact on the environment is it's a result, I, of several different factors, including the P, which stands for population, overall numbers, how many people, but also as, or more importantly, affluence, which is a fancy word for consumption. How much are people consuming? Population matters, but remember, a small proportion of the population consumes the bulk of the resources and produces most of the pollution. The US, for example, only 5% of the population produces over a third of the pollution and consumes over a third of the resources. So it's not just population, but also consumption, affluence, and combined with the role of technology. Technology can help mitigate human impact on the environment. For example, switching over to solar versus burning fossil fuels, that might reduce impact. However, technology can go both ways. It can also worsen our impact on the environment by allowing us to continue to consume. I'll give you an example in a moment. And so affluence, trends indicate that affluence, consumption, is now seen as a key variable driving impact on the environment. And the data shows that this is increases in consumption rather than population growth is probably a more important driver behind increases in resource use. In the past, and still today, even in expert policy circles, you hear people talk about, oh, the population problem. We have too many people and not enough resources. And that's why we have poverty and environmental degradation. And that's bullshit. We don't have a production problem. We have a distribution problem. You just read about it in Hartman Boyce, Needless Hunger. And it goes back to Thomas Malthus, who wrote about population over 200 years ago. And that's what he said. He said, humans will outstrip the food supply, resulting in checks on the population, famine, death, fighting, until it's brought back down below carrying capacity. This is overly simplistic and not necessarily true. Nonetheless, people continue to focus on population, and their solutions, therefore, are, oh, let's sterilize people, which has happened in India. Your tax dollars from the US have gone to India to pay to sterilize impoverished females there so that they don't have more children, to deal with the population problem, to solve environmental problems. It's an erroneous understanding of the problem. Population is not the most important variable. Affluence, consumption is. And so trends over recent decades has been towards more consumption. In terms of the stuff we buy or stuff that's available to us, there is more variety and choices than ever, and things have gotten bigger and bigger. Look at the SUV. All sorts of SUVs exist. Does anyone know why SUVs were originally designed? The answer is they were designed for people that lived in the mountains and in rugged terrain, in areas that you couldn't get to in a normal car or sedan. That's what SUVs were designed for. All that bullshit about safety and convenience and luxury and carting the family around, that got tacked on later to sell more SUVs. So from cars to SUVs to really big vehicles, some recreational vehicles are bigger than my apartment. My apartment's not that shitty. From the sailboat to the yacht, things are becoming bigger and there's more choices, more variety than ever. One result of this increasing consumption is increasing CO2 emissions. North Americans, the United States, leads the pack. This shows CO2 emissions per capita. On average, the average person in the United States emits 20 tons of CO2 per year. This is compared with a world average of just 3 tons. So more consumption equals more CO2, driving climate change. What about technology? Can this help mitigate human impact on the environment? And the answer is yes and no. It depends on how it's used. And so on the slide, overall fuel economy for cars or light trucks peaked in 1987 at about 22 miles per gallon. It had been getting better and better over time. In 2004, it dropped a little to 20.8 miles per gallon, but just a little. Over this same time period, however, as miles per gallon stagnated, fuel efficiency stagnated, weight for vehicles has increased over the same time period from about 3,000 to 4,000 pounds. So all the while fuel efficiency is getting more efficient, improving, which results in less burning of fossil fuels and therefore less CO2 emissions. Instead of those gains going to cutting CO2 emissions, what do people do? They buy bigger cars and they drive more often. So any gains in fuel efficiency via technology didn't go towards less gas or less CO2 emissions, but it allowed people to buy bigger vehicles and drive more miles per year. Technology can help mitigate human impact on the environment, but only if the all else, the consuming behavior, remains the same. If technology just allows us to go on continuing to consume and consuming even more in this case, then it doesn't, not only doesn't help mitigate impact, it can exacerbate it, it can make it worse. Houses have gotten bigger. On the left, that's the average size of a single family home in the 1950s. On the right, average single family home in the 2000s. Is this progress? Is this advancement? Are our lives better, more fulfilling? We have more stuff, we have bigger houses. Why do Americans produce so much CO2, so much pollution? Because we're consuming more stuff and bigger stuff. On the chart shows median and average square feet for single family homes being built starting in 1973 all the way up until 2004. And it's broken down by region and all these other variables. But what you're seeing is the average house size has increased by like 50% over the last several decades. Not to mention some of the really, really big houses being built these days, these mansions, right? This graph just shows one family homes. We are using more and more electronics and appliances and the fossil fuels that are required to run these things. For example, air conditioners. From 1973 to 2004, during this time period, almost 3 times as many homes started being built with AC. So if you look, just look over here, 1973% of homes being built without with air conditioning, about 49, and percent being built without, about 51. So about half and half being built with, half without. By 2004, 90% of new homes are being built with AC, only 10% are not. All the trends show this clear, steady increase in consumption. And the more units also means not just making the stuff and transporting the stuff, that's consuming, but also the energy required to run these appliances and electronics. Portion sizes have gotten bigger and there's more choices. And this is not an accident. This is actually part of a marketing trick that helps shape your choice in order to get you to buy, i.e. consume more, which keeps profits rising. So when Coca-Cola first released their product, the portion size was 6.5 ounces, shown by the cup in the picture, because you can't really even buy that portion size anymore. Although they do have the little miniature cans now, but whatever. And then that went up to the can, the 8-ounce can, the 12-ounce bottle, 20-ounce bottle, and even the 34-ounce, the 2-liter, the big bottle of soda. And so usually I like to ask students which one would they pick. So let's just pretend you drink soda or pretend it's kombucha or whatever. Not alcohol, because then we'd all probably pick the big one. Okay, so which one would you pick? And some people pick the small one because that's all they're going to consume. Sometimes, depending on what they're using it for, people will pick the big one. Sometimes because they get more bang for their buck, they can use it later. They might have a family, so it's more appropriate to get the bigger size. And sometimes the big ones are almost the same price as the small ones. They're often only a few cents more, like the small soda versus the extra large at a drive-through fast food place is usually only 30 cents more, even though it's like 3 times as much soda. This is not an accident. This is a marketing trick. And this is where different portion sizes come from, again, to get us to sort of consume more. And so this actually goes back to movie theaters and research surrounding how to sell more popcorn. So in movies, they don't make their money off of selling tickets, but selling condiments, popcorn. And the owner of these movie theaters was trying to figure out how to sell more concessions. And try as he might, he couldn't figure out how to. People, no matter what, wouldn't buy more than 1 bag of popcorn, even though there was all these different promotions that they tried. And so the movie theater owner hired a researcher to come in and research this. And this is what the guy found. People did want more popcorn, just like they want more French fries from McDonald's. You can see people licking the bag and scraping out the burnt crumbs to try to get the last little bits of what's in the portion that they got. So people do want more. The reason they won't go, this is what his research results showed. The reason why they won't go back and get another popcorn is something he called sort of the piggish or gluttony principle. Basically, people feel kind of like pigs going back to get a second serving. But if people can buy a larger serving in one trip, they will. It eliminates this sort of feeling like a pig going to buy another serving. And so he told the movie theater guy to do it. Guy sort of ignored him for a while. Eventually instituted it, and sales from concessions soared because it cost the company almost nothing to produce the larger size. They're already producing the bottle or the package and the product. It cost them fractions of a penny to make the 2 liter versus the 6.5 ounce. Almost nothing, right? But when they sell you the larger size, they're making another 30 cents, another dollar, another whatever. And so it costs them almost nothing to make that bigger size, but they're making a huge profit when you buy that larger size. It's a marketing trick. It shapes our choices, right? Why am I going to buy this little one when I get the 2 liter? It's only 10 cents more. Again, the company, it costs them almost nothing to do that, but you're paying 10 cents more, right? Huge, huge profits. This is actually where sizes come from in the fast food restaurants. This guy's research on popcorn. It shapes our choice, and it's a way to get us to buy more where we otherwise would not. So we're consuming more bigger houses, cars, portion sizes, more stuff. Has all of this added consumption made us any happier? And I think the assumption that goes in often to living the good life, having a good wage, getting a good job, is that material wealth and security will translate into well-being. Does it? Has this material wealth and more money made us happier? The answer is no. And so there's several different things going on in the graphs, and we'll sort of break down each. On the top left, that's median family income in 1953 versus 2001. And it's almost doubled from 24,000 to about 51,000. Below that is average income identified by adults as enough to fill all your dreams. So note that in 1987 it was 50,000. And by 2001, as you see from the graph above, people were indeed making over 50,000. Yet before 2001 even rolls around, back to the bottom, 1994, Americans said they needed at least 100,000 to meet all their dreams. And so what people say they need to be happy seems to be rising in line with what they are actually making. Part of the reason for that we've already touched on when we talked about consumption and looked at the story of stuff and this notion of relative versus absolute wealth. Happiness is not so much related to absolute wealth, but rather relative wealth, how rich or poor you are within a given society. So that if the whole society becomes wealthier, as we have, no one really becomes any happier. Yet, if individuals within a given society become richer, they tend to be happier. It's this idea of relative wealth and keeping up with the Joneses. We're always sort of comparing above and below us. And so that even as our income goes up, so do our expectations, right? And so that happiness really hasn't changed over time, even though we have more stuff, even though we're making more money. On the right top, percentage of college freshmen, why they're going to college, either to be well off financially or to develop a meaningful philosophy of life. And we'll look at that in just a sec. And on the bottom, percentage of Americans very happy from 1957 to 2000. Income has gone up, as I'll show you. As you can see from this graph, happiness has not. It's even declined slightly. So what the hell is going on? Okay, this is aspirations of college students in the USA. From 1967 to 1999, the green line represents, so the students were asked, going to college is very important or essential to what? Either be very well off financially, as represented by the blue line, or to develop a meaningful philosophy of life, as seen by the green line. And so as you can see in the 60s, over 80% of people said they were going to develop their understanding of the world, a meaningful philosophy of life. Um, and the numbers add to over 100 because people might have picked both reasons, right? Also going for finances. That has declined to develop a meaningful philosophy of life, and going to become well off financially, that's increased so that today almost 80% of people go for the money rather than for the knowledge. And again, the assumption I think being that money will result in the good life. The problem is this reality or is this kind of a trick? And so this graph shows that in the US, income as measured by gross domestic product per head, household income per year, has steadily increased from 1946 up until 1996. So it's increased for the last 50 years. But the percent of people that identify as very happy has not. It's even declined slightly. Despite an overall increase in income, there's actually been a decrease in happiness. We're making more money than we were 20, 30, 60 years ago. We have more stuff. Our houses are twice as big. Why aren't we more happy? So on the one hand, this has to do with this notion of relative versus absolute wealth, right? Which I just sort of touched on. This culture of consumption, this keeping up with the Joneses, always sort of measuring and comparing. I could have had this, but I could be like them. Could be this. And so that keeps us consuming. And also, having unlimited choices can also generate unhappiness. I'll touch on that in a sec. Another thing that we can conclude from this. So, on the one hand, happiness hasn't increased because it's not really related to absolute wealth, it's more related to relative wealth, keeping up with the Joneses. And then on the other hand, there's also a lot of evidence to suggest that stuff, material wealth, money, is not really what makes people happy, at least not in the long run. So there's this documentary, and I highly recommend if you can find it, called I Am. It was made by a guy named Tom Shadyac, who's the same guy that made the movie Ace Ventura, which we've all seen, of course. And so Tom Shadyac, he's sort of living the good life. He is really successful. All these movies, these Hollywood hits are coming out. And he moves into this big mansion in the Hollywood Hills, very well off, living the good life. And he's sort of standing in his new home and he realizes, man, I don't really feel any different. I'm not really any happier. And then he also gets, and this is sort of, he talks about this in the documentary, sort of explaining how he came to start this film. And then he gets in this really bad accident and ends up in the hospital for months. And he gets super depressed. He almost commits suicide. And at the same time, he's also noticing all these social ills around him, depression, increasing suicide rates, anxiety, mental health. And so he decides, well, fuck, if I'm going to kill myself, I'm going to look into this a little bit first. And so he sort of sets out to explore what's going on. And he ends up exploring in large part of the film this relationship between, or lack of, between consumption, material, and happiness. And so there's an example from the documentary that I want to highlight. Um, and in the example, this scientist talks about there's a truth and a lie in terms of this idea that more stuff, more money can bring us more happiness. And so here's the truth. The truth is that if you're out, you're in the forest, in the mountains, it's snowing in winter, you're cold, and you're lost, and you have no idea where you're going, you don't have any supplies, you're pretty fucking screwed right now. You're not too happy. A little bit of frostbite on the toes, it's getting dark, not looking good. And all of a sudden, you come across a cabin. The lights are on, they've got a fire burning, there's people there, and they let you in. They're not axe murderers. You're no longer lost. They give you a little bit of warm water, maybe even some soup. And so all of a sudden, just a little bit of stuff, a little bit of warmth, maybe a little hot water, a little bit of whatever, people letting you into their home. A little bit of stuff makes a huge difference, makes you a whole lot happier than you were. That's the truth. The lie is that that much more stuff will bring you that much more happiness. Um, and it doesn't. And one reason for that is because things, stuff, money isn't a very big predictor of happiness. There's other things that are correlated with it. And so, on that note, this book, Stumbling on Happiness, written by Daniel Gilbert, think you know what makes you happy. And a main point centers on how research shows it's relationships and experiences that are central to our happiness rather than money and material. And so, just to read a few excerpts. We know that the best predictor of human happiness is human relationships and the amount of time that people spend with family and friends. We know that it's significantly more important than money and somewhat more important than health. That's what the data shows. The interesting thing is that people will sacrifice social relationships to get other things that won't make them as happy, money. That's what I mean when I say people should do wise shopping for happiness. Another thing we know from studies is that people tend to take more pleasure in experiences than things. So if you have X amount of dollars to spend on a vacation or a good meal or movies, it will get you more happiness than a durable good or an object. One reason for this is that experiences tend to be shared with other people and objects usually aren't. So relationships, experiences, not stuff. These are the biggest predictors of happiness. And it kind of makes sense to me. I mean, when I'm daydreaming, I'm not usually thinking about my new shirt or stuff I got. Maybe if I just got it and I'm all stoked on it. But usually I'm thinking about friends, inside jokes, trips, my travels. I mean, right? Um, so take it or leave it, but interesting food for thought. Regardless of the relationship between happiness and consumption, which suggests a little overall relationship exists, we are consuming. And one result of that is people in the US lead the pack in terms of how much CO2 we are emitting. Um, so if everyone in the world emitted as much CO2 at the same level that North Americans do, people in the US do, we would need 9 Earths to absorb all the CO2 in order to prevent dangerous climate change. So Earth's capacity refers to the amount of emissions that can be absorbed back into the planet without causing significant and dangerous climate change. So if everyone consumed at the same rate we did, we'd need 9 Earths to absorb all that CO2 to keep the climate from drastically changing more than it already is. And other countries are on the rise. Right now, right, the US is a small percentage of the population, 5% of the global population, but we produce 30 to 40% of the pollution and consume like 40% of the world's resources. Just 5% of the population. Other countries are developing and on the rise. Think China, think India. And if every Chinese person wants to live like Americans, and people want to eat more meat. They want to sleep on beds, all these different things. What are the implications of this for future sustainability and social justice if other countries start to consume at the levels that we are consuming? And so, in general, large scale industrial, post industrial societies, the way we're organized socially and culturally doesn't seem to be sustainable. We'll see how long it lasts. We've only been around a couple hundred years. And how do you measure adaptive success? You do it through long term survival. So we'll see. On that note, what can we learn? What lessons might we take from indigenous societies and small scale cultures about our current environmental dilemmas? So, what can we learn from indigenous societies? And remember, humans have been living in small scale indigenous societies for 100,000 years plus, really more like 2 million. And the best measure of adaptive success is long term survival. Industrial and post industrial society have only been around a couple of hundred years. We'll see how sustainable it is at current rates of consumption, pollution, and environmental destruction. So, what can we learn from indigenous people to inform our own future directions to be more sustainable? The map shows the South American Amazon basin, the Amazon rainforest. Very rich rainforest with lots of natural resources. And this rainforest is also important in terms of serving as a carbon sink. The trees absorb CO2, which helps remove some of the CO2 we're emitting into the atmosphere that's causing climate change. And so on the map, the red shows areas that have been heavily deforested. And then the green represents something else. And notice how there's almost no overlap between the green areas and the deforested areas. And those green areas represent indigenous land. Again, notice that there's almost no overlap between the two. And so if you look, this is showing satellite imagery of the rainforest in Rondônia, Brazil. The area open to industrial capitalism and logging companies is destroyed. It's completely deforested. And this isn't just getting rid of the trees, it destroys the habitat and all the species that live there. And when you start changing tree cover on this large of a scale, you can start changing rainfall patterns, climatic patterns, and regional weather and topography and climate altogether, right? And then the area that is controlled by indigenous groups, you can see is remained intact. It hasn't been degraded. Deforestation's not going on in that area. And so how do indigenous people tend to view the environment, tend to view nature? We talked about some Western large-scale views. What about indigenous people? And they are most similar to what we call the egalitarian view, meaning nature is ephemeral, it's delicate, it's fleeting, it's short-lasting, it's balanced, and very easily you can disrupt that balance. You see the ball in the picture sort of sitting on top of the ark. That's symbolic of nature. You can touch it a little bit, mess with it a little bit, but if you start really pushing it around, you're going to knock it right off the edge, right? And so these folks would emphasize that everything in nature is connected, including humans. Therefore, events are directly or indirectly a consequence of human actions. People's actions have effects. We would be living in, I think, a better world if more people would recognize that their actions don't exist in a vacuum and they do affect other people. And because of this, they typically treat nature with careful respect in order to avoid adverse consequences. And so the big debate is, does this worldview, this egalitarian nature is delicate and you need to treat it with respect, lead to an intentional conservation ethic? Are indigenous people intentional conservationists? And the answer is sort of no, yes, maybe, not, yes and no. And so they're not necessarily intentional conservationists in the same way that like the World Wildlife Fund sets out to save the panda bears. Um, but these people need to continue to live and survive in their local environment, and that leads them to avoid behaviors that degrade their resource base. So the small scale indigenous world is not necessarily, they're not necessarily intentional conservationists, but it does tend to be a more sustainable system overall compared to large scale cultures. Um, just to sort of expand on that, this anthropologist John Bodley talks about small scale societies reflect ecosystem people. So they actually live in their immediate environments, and as soon as their actions become degrading to their resource base and have a detrimental impact on their environment, they can see that, they recognize that, and they can react accordingly and change what they're doing so that they don't destroy the resource base they rely on. In contrast, biosphere people, us, the US, the commercial global market capitalism societies, we are able to defer our damaging practices on the environment. We would have overexploited our resource base and our environment a way long time ago in the US, for example, but we don't extract just from our environment. We extract from other people's environments all around the globe. We also export our pollution back out to all these other places, and we exploit labor from these places. And so we don't always feel or recognize the impact, the deleterious and maladaptive effects that we're having on the environment because our actions often affect other people's environments and other people's societies rather than our own, right? We defer a lot of our damaging practices onto other people and their environments. We externalize those costs onto other people and other places around the world. And so small scale societies, they're not necessarily intentional noble conservationists, but they do tend to be more sustainable overall because they rely on their immediate environment. And that tends to not generate beliefs and behaviors that destroy their resource base. So, are indigenous people ecologically noble? Are they always good stewards of the environment? And this notion has been misused before. So, let's explore this for a moment. Just a few more things to cover before we wrap up. In some cases, non-Western, non-industrial societies have completely destroyed their local environments. One example comes from Jared Diamond's book Collapse, in which he talks about various societies overshooting their resource base, degrading their environments, ultimately leading to the societies collapsing. And so the example I'll highlight for you comes from Rapa Nui, also called Easter Island. It's a small isolated island out in the Pacific. You can see it pictured on the map. And the Rapa Nui people were there from about 900 to 1700 AD. Shortly thereafter, when Europeans arrived, the island had been almost completely depopulated and it was also deforested. He says the Rapa Nui society essentially collapsed. The population by the time Europeans arrived was something like 2 to 3,000. Um, just a century earlier, the population was like 15,000. So rapid population decline. And there was also no trees over 10 feet tall when Europeans arrived. And so essentially, Jared Diamond attributes the collapse of the Rapa Nui to deforestation. And he says they were deforesting the island in order to move around these large statues called moai. You can see a picture of it here. I think it's also an emoji on your smartphones, a little moai. So that's where that comes from. And so these moai are these giant statues, anywhere from 20 to 70 feet tall. They weigh like 25,000 to 50,000 pounds. And there was no machinery or cranes at the time to move these statues around. And so the statues are related to the religion on Rapa Nui. I'm going to keep that brief. But essentially, different clans and chiefs on the island would compete with one another by building ever more elaborate statues to outdo one another. And part of the Easter chiefs and the priests, they justified their elite social status by claiming divinity, relationships to the gods, and in turn promising fertility, the crops will come, the rains will come. And they were able to buttress this power, this religious ideology, through monumental architecture to sort of legitimize their power. And so, as competition, what Diamond says, and this is very debatable, other scholars would say Diamond's incorrect, and that what led to the decline on Rapa Nui had to do with depopulation or overpopulation, leading to a lack of resources, and also introduction of invasive species, rats, that would have ate the trees and the wood. But neither here nor there. I won't ask you about it. Just know that people don't agree on this is what happened. But what Diamond says, as the different clans were competing with one another, trying to build ever more elaborate and bigger statues, the way that they were moving these statues around was using logs chopped down from the forest to use as rollers. And so as they built more and more statues and were competing, they would have had to cut more and more of the forest down to transport the statues. They would have also been cutting the forest down to create agricultural land and also to build sea vessels to go fishing with. Also, through deforestation, there's less and less of a habitat for the wildlife that they used to hunt and gather. And so essentially, deforestation in pursuit of the religion and building these statues became the reason for the collapse. The deforestation eventually meant they had no more trees to build fishing vessels. They couldn't go fishing. It also screwed up their agricultural production. And so with deforestation, you start to get erosion because there's no trees or roots holding the soil in place. So all that topsoil starts to erode. It makes the soil less fertile. It's difficult to grow crops in it if you can grow anything in it. Um, and so ultimately, over time, very quickly, the society ultimately collapsed. And so it's kind of a case study in which you can see indigenous people are not necessarily good stewards of their environment. There are cases in which they have undermined and destroyed the environments on which their societies depend. But in other cases, communal management by indigenous or local communities has often been better at conserving resources than market forces or bureaucracies. And so market forces, meaning sort of privatization, let the company or the individual own it. And the idea is they'll care for it because they own it. Often the opposite happens. Look at the deforestation going on in the rainforest, open to industrial capitalism. These private owners aren't looking at, they're not interested in sustaining the rainforest. They're interested in taking from it and selling it for profit. So privatization, markets don't ensure conservation by any means. And bureaucracies, meaning government regulation. The idea is institute government regulations so that people don't get greedy and destroy the resources we all need. Well, that doesn't assure conservation or sustainability either. The Trump administration is a fantastic example of that right now. Currently, of about the 80 major environmental regulations we have, stuff like keep the air clean, keep the water clean, basics, about 60 of them have been completely slashed, meaning gone, meaning policies that have been in place for 50, 60 years, right, to protect us, just gone, right? And the reason is to deregulate businesses so that they can make more money. Right, so governments and privatization, that doesn't necessarily ensure conservation by any means. And so what can we learn from indigenous management of the environment and sustainable resource use? And this is sort of the third and last thread that I want to talk about. So many small-scale societies are great examples of long-term sustainable human-environment interaction. And so one thing we can learn from them is what types of techniques and management strategies did they use, and we can draw upon that to manage our own resources. So a few different examples. One is sustainable farming techniques. Things like agroforestry. So agroforestry is when, in contrast to farming and monocropping like how we do in the US, other groups have practiced something called agroforestry. So you plant some crops, maybe some corn, but you also plant fruit trees and apples and other trees. And you also have flowering plants, and you also have animals. And so animals will eat the grass grows from the sun. The animals defecate, that manure fertilizes the soil, creating more grass for the animals to feed off of. It also fertilizes the soil for the crops you're growing. The trees provide shade. Crops don't need full sunlight. That can actually be a problem. And so the idea in agroforestry is you integrate crops, trees, animals into the system, and it sort of models natural ecology. You have all these different species filling different niches, recycling waste, producing fertility. You model your agricultural system, your farming, off of the natural ecology, right? Use what nature has sort of already figured out and then apply that to farming. Another example is something called intercropping. So in the US, in industrial agriculture, to make our plants grow, our food grow, we use a shit ton of fertilizer. Fertilizer is essentially nitrogen. On that note, for you coffee drinkers, coffee grounds are almost all nitrogen, which means they're fertilizer. Dump them on your soil, on your house plants, or in the soil. Use it. Go spread coffee grounds all around the soil. It's nitrogen, it's fertilizer, it's awesome. Okay, so intercropping is, so we use fertilizer to keep growing stuff, corn, day in, day out. And when you plant the same crop in the soil again and again, it exhausts the fertility to the point where there's no more nutrients left for plant growth. That's why we have to add fertilizer every time we plant. Intercropping is a way to maintain soil fertility naturally, and it also eliminates the need for all these toxic fertilizers and other chemicals and herbicides and pesticides. And so what you do is you plant your crop of corn or whatever, and then you harvest it. And then instead of planting corn again, you plant legumes, bean crops. And legume plants naturally, just as a product of their evolution, have this bacteria that grow on their roots that trade the plant a little drop of sugar. They eat a little drop of sugar, and the byproduct of that bacteria is a little molecule of nitrogen gets fixed into the soil. So they feed off the sugar of the plant, and the byproduct, the waste of the bacteria, is nitrogen, which gets fixed back into the soil. And so you grow your corn, you harvest, you plant your legumes, You then harvest those too, lentils or whatever. And after you harvest the lentils, the soil is already refertilized because of the bacteria that naturally grows on those roots. And then you plant your corn again. You don't have to use external fertilizer. The fossil fuels required to create fertilizer, which is a shit ton, by the way, because we have to create synthetic nitrogen, which uses a lot of energy to do that. That's what fertilizer comes from. And so you eliminate all of that just by modeling farming on things that nature has sort of already figured out. Cover cropping is another one, and I actually just experimented with this with my fiance's parents. Have a big orchard, and I weeded it for them, and then I took dead leaves from a tea leaf tree, so these big broad leaves, and then I covered the soil where the weeds were. And months later, it's been like 4 months, not a single weed has popped up. In the cover crop, the dead plant remains covering the soil. What happens is it blocks out the sunlight, and that prevents the weed seeds from being able to germinate. So do a cover crop, and then you don't have to use herbicides and pesticides and all these other poisonous toxic chemicals that we use too much of that go into our air and our water and our environments. Okay, so that's one example, sort of sustainable. There's other ways to grow food and manage our resources that don't have to destroy the very environment that we rely on. Okay, and then the next and sort of last thing I'll highlight for you is forms of passive and active environmental management. And so, how have small scale societies managed their environments? And how's it's been sustainable? So, passive management first. It's passive because it's not necessarily intentional or conscious. So I'll explain through an example. Pictured on the slide is rice-based polyculture in Bali, Indonesia. And so those are terraced rice fields. They grow rice, but also other crops. And there's fish and ducks that live in the paddies. It's a really fertile, productive system done all by human labor. And so it's passive, it's productive, it's maintained the environment, if not increased the fertility of the soil. But that's not what they're doing. They're not purposely doing that. So in Bali, Indonesia, in this area, they have something called subaks. And you can kind of think of a subak as like its own little village cluster. It's a cluster of households in each subak. And so in Bali, water is landlocked, meaning it comes from inside the island, down the hill, out to the coast. If everyone in Bali, all the different subaks, want to water their rice fields at the same time, there will not be enough. So the planting of the fields and the watering of it is staggered. So the fields on the top plant, a couple of weeks later, the next field's down plant, and so on. And the field at the top waters. A couple of weeks later, they let their water out into the next fields, and so on. So that irrigation is staggered, and in this way, there's enough water for everyone. But the irrigation system, and this is the passive component, the irrigation, the timing of the water is related to their religious rituals surrounding the water goddess and the water temples. So it's actually the religion and the religious beliefs that drives the timing of the irrigation. The passive result, though, is this really sustainable rice-based farming system. And again, it's passive because people aren't actively managing the water with the notion of let's be sustainable. And it's not that they're stupid, they probably clearly recognize that's an outcome. But rather, the staggered irrigation is a result of the religion. And in turn, that indirectly has created this really sustainable system. Um, and then there's also active environmental management. So in contrast to passive, people are actively, consciously manipulating their environments to make them more conducive to their own purposes. One example of active management is something called community-based resource management, or CBRM. And so this is when control over the resources is given to the local community, the actual resource users, the people closest to the resource. Go figure. And the general assumption in the Western world has been that resource degradation is inevitable. Unless private property is converted to, unless common property is converted into private property or it's government regulated. And as we already discussed, neither of these assure sustainable resource use, right? Community-based resource management is one alternative that works in some cases. And this notion that the general assumption that resource degradation is inevitable, this is sort of the tragedy of the commons. This is the idea that people will always act in their own rational self-interest to maximize their own benefits. And because of that, common pool resources will always be overexploited because everyone is going to look out for themselves and therefore everyone's going to use it. There won't actually be enough. Um, this is this assumes that resources are always open access, and it also assumes that people act only with their own self-interest, that that's all that motivates them. And that may be true for some people in the Western world, but that's not necessarily a cultural value in other places. And so one example where community-based resource management works is in traditional fishing communities in the Solomon Islands. And so in Solomon Islands, for example, pictured here, one of the fishermen, households and villages, different villages, they have what we call sea tenure. So they have access to garden land and also part of the sea, part of the lagoon, where it belongs to them and everyone sort of knows that that's their waters. There's no sort of physical boundaries, but everyone knows where the boundaries are and everyone respects them. There has to be things in place for this to actually work, right? It tends to be more conducive in small scale societies because everyone knows everyone, because people can actually monitor one another. And usually social stigmatization is enough to keep people from violating the rules. They also have taboos, certain areas that'll be kept off limits from fishing, like the mangroves during spawning, which is important to fish reproduction. So all these things sort of built in to the beliefs and practices of the communities that results in them each having their needs met and also not overexploiting the environment. That's the overall effect. Another thing is that what I'm talking about here, this is typically subsistence economies where community-based resource management works. And so people are fishing or gardening, producing for their own consumption, not for sale on the market or for profit. And so there's no incentive to fish or exploit beyond household needs, really. When markets are introduced, this changes incentives and often it changes practices. Once you introduce markets, the incentive to exploit more in order to sell that for cash and profit on the market is now there. There's now an incentive to exploit beyond household needs for sale in the market. And it's not necessarily a bad thing. I mean, some people in Solomon Islands, they're trying to sell a little bit of fish in the market so they can buy a little bit of iron, corrugated iron for their roof to keep the rain from leaking on their heads while they're sleeping. But once markets are introduced, it changes the incentives. There's now an incentive to exploit and produce and extract beyond what you need for your house or your village for sale in the market. So environmental degradation is not a result of human nature. It's a result of specific cultural beliefs and practices. And you know what? This is a good thing because if people are the problem, people are also the solution. Just a couple of last points to wrap up the course for the semester. Anthropology might not have all the answers, and indeed, often I give you no answers. But we do have good questions. The questions you ask are just as important as the answers. The way we conceptualize problems and their causes, the way we understand things, the questions we ask, this is going to influence and frame how we understand it, how we choose to solve it. And so if you're not understanding the situation, you're not getting the question right in the first place, who cares about the answer anyways? Famous British anthropologist Bronislaw Malinowski, sort of famous for participant observation and fieldwork, said, the ideal for anthropology is explaining us to ourselves, making humankind more intelligible to itself. In other words, why do you do what you do? Why do you think what you think and behave how you behave? It is not necessarily natural or inevitable or the only way. Why do other people think and behave the way they do? And the answer is we are products of culture. Franz Boas, the father of American anthropology, called that because his contributions were so fundamental to the field and still are to this day. said, "A knowledge of anthropology enables us to look with greater freedom at the problems confronting our civilization. You want to understand the causes of and the solutions to our problems? Understand the framework, the culture in which we live first." Anthropologists also look at the great diversity of cultures throughout space and time. There's a lot we can learn from other societies about the problems we face today. And so anthropology is not only important for understanding ourselves better, our own culture, and the way in which we are influenced by it, but also for seeing the wealth of alternatives out there to human and environmental problems that are provided by past and present societies cross-culturally. If anything, anthropology can give you hope. The way things are today are not fixed in stone. They are not set in stone. They are not inevitable. They are not. They are created. We are very much in control of our own destiny. And so hopefully, let's shape it how we want it, right? And on that note, vote, get involved, stay informed. People created it. People can change it. A couple last notes. Bronislaw Malinowski, again, the ideal for anthropology, explaining us to ourselves, making humankind more intelligible to itself. How? You want to learn more about other societies and your own? Go out and travel the world. Understand the matrix, right? How is your behavior and your perception shaped by the culture you live in? How are others shaped by their cultures? Go see the world. It is totally worth the effort. This takes time. I'm not talking about a weekend trip to Mexico or a couple of weeks in Europe, right? Vacation is not the same as traveling. Go travel, learn a new language, immerse yourself in the culture, talk to the people, eat the food, do what they're doing. I promise. And vacation too. Go drink tequila on the beach, but travel too. Immerse yourself, and I promise you will not regret it. We are in a matrix. Can you perceive it? Okay, so with that, that'll do it for the semester. I really enjoyed having you as a class. I know that it was a weird semester and not the easiest semester for everyone. And so I just also want to say you've all been really great, and I'm just impressed in the way you've all handled it. So job well done. And if you have any questions about the material, the class, the exam, please contact me. And on top of that, we're not wrapping up in person, but also know that my door is always open to you in the future as well, either virtually or when we return to campus one day. And so I enjoyed having you as a class. Just like the teacher can sort of ruin the class for students, students can also do that to the teacher. And before we switched online, you guys were definitely on track to be probably one of my favorite classes ever. So we'll still say that you are. So thanks for a good semester. I'm really excited to see what you all go do in the world. I hang my hope on all of you. And so with that, good luck on the final exam. Study, ask questions if you have them, and I hope after we're done, you'll have a really great summer. All right, I'll still be around for the rest of the semester, but that'll do it for lecture. See ya.